Jay gave me 4 seconds to inspire you. So I think I just blew it. Sorry, Jay. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here. It's nice to have a standing room only. I'll get to go home and brag to my wife. Standing room only crowd at the Clinton School. Well, I want to start off with a question. And the question is, how many of you all have seen this movie? I know some of you are far away. It's Rambo, 1985, Sylvester Stallone. Raise your hand, come on. Okay, that's what I like to see. At least there are a few of you who've seen it's a Cold War classic. But for those of you who don't have the 20th anniversary 3 DVD box set, I'll fill you in a little bit. John Rambo is a Vietnam War veteran who goes back to Vietnam, charged with the impossible task of finding American prisoners 10 years after the war had ended and bring them back home. And so the buff Rambo goes off charging into the jungle, shirtless, of course, and spends much of the movie blowing things up and killing Vietnamese, and communists left and right. It's quite the adrenaline rush. But as I look back at that movie, what strikes me as remarkable is that the villain is neither communist nor Vietnamese. The villain, you may recall, is a wimpy government bureaucrat named Murdoch. Yeah, a feckless government official who tries to stymie Rambo in his heroic quest. Now, those of you who remember the movie may remember the climactic scene, right, when Rambo's being tortured by his Vietnamese captors. And, of course, we always know what torture is when Americans are being tortured. But that's another story. And he grabs the microphone and he says, he's calling home, and he says, "Murdoch, I'm coming to get you." And then he spends the rest of the movie blowing things up and killing people and rescuing the POWs and bringing them back home. And then he faces the cringing Murdoch, the cringing bureaucrat in his office at the end. So it's very exciting stuff, especially if you're a 12-year-old boy like I was when I first saw the movie, at least the first time. Anyway, I didn't miss the message of the movie at all. I mean, this is the mid-1980s, Cold War, age of Reagan. And I can remember talking to my mom one day and putting on my best Rambo sneer, and I said, "I hate bureaucrats." I don't think I even knew what the word bureaucrat meant, but it was in the movie, and Rambo hated bureaucrats, so I hate bureaucrats. My mom, kind of arched her eyebrow and said, "Really? Your daddy's a bureaucrat." Fighting words on the playground, but my mom said it, and the worst thing was, she was right. My daddy was a bureaucrat. You see, my father served 36 years in the Foreign Service, and he was, thus, one of those dreadful, hated government workers. Now, I love my father, and I was very close to him, but I, too, somehow had internalized this cultural disdain for people who did my father's work, people who worked day in and day out in government, citizens who served America in a civilian capacity. And to me, Rambo represents Hollywood's dramatization of a larger cultural phenomenon that kind of took root during Vietnam and Watergate. It flourished during the age of Reagan and remains entrenched even after 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina, even after last week when the Wall Street tycoons come running with their tails between their legs for government to bail them out. It's still there, and this phenomenon involves the knee-jerk, the reflexive denigration of government, the frequent association of the word public with inferior, and the widespread rejection of public sector work as meaningful or important. Basically, public service just isn't cool anymore. So how did we get there? I mean, it wasn't always this way. I mean, for young people growing up in the post-World War II era, public service stood out as a noble calling, something for our best and brightest to pursue. A half-century of government reform from the progressive Republicans of Teddy Roosevelt to the New Deal Democrats of his cousin Franklin had created a strong public sector, and it had earned the trust and the respect of its citizens in both times of war and peace. From the government scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project to the officials who prepared and implemented the Marshall Plan to the folks who built the interstate highway system. I mean, even on TV shows like Dragnet, public servants were respected. Students graduating from our best colleges look forward to careers in government service. I mean, I look at my own parents. My father attended Williams. He graduated, spent a year in the Merchant Marines, and then joined the Foreign Service in 1961. My mother went to Harvard and then Georgetown Medical School before embarking on a medical career that encompassed a host of government jobs, including her current one at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. So for my parents and countless others like them, John Kennedy's famous "Ask not what your country can do for you" speech it added glamour and cachet to public service. I mean, he made it cool. But he did not so much create the fire for service as just fan the flames. Now, today's college students are the much celebrated 9/11 generation. And it's a generation motivated to serve and get involved. According to the Higher Education Research Institute, more than 70% of the incoming freshman class in 2007 expressed a desire to serve others. It's the highest rate in a generation. Applications to programs such as Teach for America, my program, City Year, Jay's program, Peace Corps, any Peace Corps, woohoo! They've skyrocketed. And in religious organizations like the Common Ground Collective and the North American Mission Board, they too report a marked increase in the number of students who are interested in mission trips, volunteer projects, and service opportunities. And yet, even today, young people often share Rambo's distaste for public service. And when I say that, I mean the work in the public sector, in public institutions, in government. Yes, government. One recent poll by the Council for Excellence in Government reported that basically we've moved from the ask not generation to the generation not asked, because fully 3/4 of young people, college seniors, report that they've never been asked to consider a career in the public sector. More and more young people say they want to help and make a difference and help people, but barely 1/3 of them consider a career in government service appealing. Even at public service-oriented programs such as Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, the percentage of students who go into public sector work, into public service after graduation, has dropped by more than half in the last generation. So we've gotten to the point where many young people, even service-oriented young people, don't even consider working in the public sector to be public service at all. It's crazy. Now, how did we get here? How did we go from John Kennedy and the fired-up young people who joined public sector work in the 1960s to now, where young people don't even consider public sector work to be public service? In fact, I just got an email from a woman, an AmeriCorps alum, who was all upset about the Public Service Academy idea because basically this meant working in government, and that's not what service is. To her, service is volunteering, it's community service. And so that only illustrates my point. And I think a lot has happened since Kennedy's inaugural speech more than 45 years ago. You know, we've grown up after Vietnam and Watergate. We've witnessed Iran-Contra and Monica Lewinsky. And so the young people of generations X and Y and the new millennials harbor few illusions about the integrity of public officials. Now, we've learned to be cynical about government. We've learned to distrust collective efforts to improve society. We've learned to be skeptical about appeals to selflessness. We've been governed by politicians of both parties who have openly mocked and belittled government. We go to schools where we're treated as paying customers rather than challenged to be civically engaged citizens. And we imbibe a popular culture that regularly depicts public servants as feckless, corrupt, and self-serving. And perhaps most importantly, we live in an economic context, and this is even worse this week than last week, that makes the cost of pursuing public service opportunities prohibitive. I mean, college tuition has increased dramatically in the past decade, 47% at private schools, 63% at public schools. And that's just in the last 10 years. You know, I'm glad I graduated from Duke when I did, because I don't think I could afford it anymore. You know, because of these soaring tuition costs, the Project on Student Debt has written a report and shows that the average student who has loans has more than $20,000 in loans. Even more, of course, that's just the average. And if you go to a private school, you have a lot more than that. So that's an increase of 50% in the past decade. So with so much debt, even students who are interested in going into public service often have to abandon their dreams and pursue a more lucrative field instead. So given all the political and social and economic forces at work, is it any wonder that public service isn't cool? I mean, should we be surprised that fewer and fewer young people are choosing public service as a career? Should we be shocked to learn that we face a looming crisis in the public sector? And we do face a crisis. The baby boomers, you know, those folks who went into public service in the 60s, they went in at far greater numbers and far greater rates than subsequent generations. Those folks are now retiring. There are more federal workers in their 60s than in their 20s. And the Partnership for Public Service has shown that almost half of the federal workforce is eligible to retire within the next 5 years. And the problem extends far beyond the federal government. The Department of Homeland Security reports that 45% of state public health agencies, 45% of their workforce is eligible to retire in the next 5 years. Public school districts across the country, including here in Little Rock and Mississippi Delta where I taught, already face massive shortages. 80% of the nation's 17,000 law enforcement districts report vacancies that they can't fill because they don't have enough qualified applicants. So everywhere you look in the public sector, you see massive and growing shortages. Now you might ask, so what? Who cares? Why does this matter? I mean, aren't we in this new age where the lines between the public sector and the private sector are blurred, right? And people can just bounce from one job or one sector to another. And shouldn't we be thinking about ways to outsource the inefficient public sector work to more effective and efficient private sector? Well, maybe. But we neglect our public sector at our own peril. As private sector scandals from Enron to Blackwater to the Wall Street mess show, turning public functions over to private entities without public servants providing careful oversight and strict accountability is a recipe for disaster. And in the 21st century, the most pressing challenges that our nation faces, from educating our young to taking care of our elderly to protecting our environment to battling terrorists, these issues are taking place in the public sector. And we need strong public institutions and strong public servants to tackle those challenges. There's simply no substitute for having top quality people who are accountable first and foremost to the country and the Constitution rather than a company. Now, no matter where we stand on the ideological spectrum, we all depend on the public sector more than we can imagine. Now, take a mental stroll. We'll kind of walk through, say, a graduate student's day, and you'll see just how important the public sector is to everyday life. Okay, so you wake up, and we won't talk about how late it was that you went to sleep or how late you're waking up in the morning. So you get up, you go to the bathroom, wash your face, brush your teeth. How do you know that water is safe to drink? As anyone who's been in a foreign country knows, and Jay was just over in India, drinking water is a luxury that Americans take for granted. It's a luxury that we enjoy because of the water treatment plants that are designed, built, and maintained by public servants. Okay, so you wash up, you head outside, get some breakfast. The air you breathe is crisp and clean, in part due to the air quality standards that are monitored and enforced by the public servants of the Environmental Protection Agency and their state counterparts. So you wolf down a bagel, maybe an egg sandwich. You don't even consider whether that food is safe because you assume that it will be because we have public servants with the Food and Drug Administration making sure of that. Okay, so you're ready for class, you're living green, so you strap on your bike helmet and hop on the bike for a quick ride across campus. You don't even think anything about the safety of that helmet or that bike because you know that the public servants of the Consumer Product Safety Commission have ensured that it meets basic safety standards. It's another public agency you rarely think about unless something goes wrong. So along the way, you ride over roads and bridges that are engineered and maintained, again, by public servants in the state and federal departments of transportation. You get to class, you power up your computer, and that electricity that courses through your computer circuits, well, that originates in the coal mines of Appalachia, which are monitored and inspected by the public servants of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And on it goes. And you know what? We haven't even talked about the basic public functions of law enforcement and healthcare and foreign affairs and environmental protection or education, let alone the emergency management roles that public agencies play after natural disasters and accidents and terrorist attacks. As much as we like to complain about government, and I complain as much as anybody when I'm at the DMV, believe me, the simple fact is we all depend on these institutions to work. And we should demand that our top students are at the helm of those institutions. So, how do we do that? How do we get more people like the folks in this room and at this school, to accept the responsibilities and rewards of public service? How can we make public service cool enough to attract the best of future generations to commit themselves to their country? Part of the answer, I believe, is that we must build a flagship institution for public leadership in this country, a symbolic institution that sends a powerful message about the importance of public service to the prosperity and vitality of our nation. this institution would tap into the patriotic energy of young people and channel it into public sector work. That institution will be the U.S. Public Service Academy. Now, the Public Service Academy would realize George Washington's dream of having a civilian college to develop civilian leaders. Now, not a lot of people know, when he was president, he envisioned two major educational institutions. One to develop military leaders, which eventually became West Point, and one to develop civilian leaders, which eventually died out. And that's what we want to rekindle. That dream of his is what we want to rekindle. The Public Service Academy would be the civilian counterpart to our nation's military academies, and there are 5 military academies. It would kind of be like West Point, but without the guns. All right. Thank you. I appreciate it. The academy would offer roughly 5,000 students an intensive undergraduate education focused on leadership development and service. Like their military academies peers, the Public Service Academy students would receive a full scholarship that will cover all their expenses during their 4 undergraduate years. In return, Academy graduates must commit 5 years of their lives serving their nation by working in public institutions at the local, state, and federal level in areas such as healthcare and law enforcement, emergency management, and so forth. And they would be placed in areas of critical need and positions of strategic importance. So the academy would be the nation's 6th service academy, but the first one for civilians. And because it will be created after 200 years of experience with the military academies, there's a lot that we can learn from West Point and the others. You know, the 5 military academies, for example, have exemplary leadership development programs, and we definitely want to learn from what they've done there. At the same time, however, the academy's unique mission, promoting civilian public service rather than military service, gives it the freedom and the obligation to depart where necessary from the norms and traditions of the military academies. For example, the academy will not impose various restrictions that apply to the military academies, such as barring students with physical disabilities or barring homosexual students. So it'll be the most inclusive of the military service academies. It would be academically competitive, but demographically inclusive. And it'll offer service opportunities to thousands of young people who have the passion to serve the nation in a civilian capacity. Now, like the cadets at the military service academies, students at the Public Service Academy would enjoy and endure a unique college experience. The campus culture, with its focus on service and serving others' interests rather than one's own, will be very demanding and very different from traditional civilian colleges. The academy will foster this intensive campus culture of service through a rigorous year-round program in which various learning experiences, from classroom work to work in the community, to study abroad, to service internships, reinforce the overarching goal of leadership development. Students will follow a structured day of classes with uniforms and mandatory classroom attendance like at the military academies, and they'll be required to participate in cultural programs and social events and service projects throughout their college career. Now, taken as a whole, these core building activities will foster unity and instill discipline and develop an ethic of service that will remain with students throughout a lifetime of public leadership. Now, students will know that their college education means more than just a degree and a ticket to the good life. They'll know that they're going to be part of something larger than themselves, part of a solution to our nation's greatest challenges. We envision the academy will become a highly visible national institution that will raise the prestige of public service. In the same way that the Peace Corps did in the 1960s, the academy has the power to capture the imagination of a generation, and it will change how young people perceive and prepare for and pursue public service. It might, maybe, make public service cool again. I mean, even just the idea, just the initiative of the Public Service Academy has captured the imagination of folks across the political spectrum. You know, Jay mentioned that the Public Service Academy Act has gained the support of more than 20 senators and more than 120 representatives, including Senator Clinton, who's actually the chief sponsor of the bill in the Senate, and Senator Lincoln from here in Arkansas is one of the co-sponsors. We also have more than 50 college presidents and deans, of course, Dean Rutherford being chief among them, who've endorsed our idea, and as well as labor unions, service organizations, including National Peace Corps Association and City Year. So we got lots of folks who've endorsed our effort, as well as major public officials, or former public officials, like former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Perhaps most exciting, we've attracted the enthusiastic support of young people from around the country. Kids who will never be able to go to our college because it doesn't exist yet, but want to be part of want to get in on the ground floor of building this new institution. So we have more than 220 students on our National Youth Council, and these kids are fantastic, and they help us mobilize support. And when I think about this, I think about where I am now, where the Public Service Academy is now compared to where I was a few years ago. It's pretty amusing. I mean, 3 years ago, the Public Service Academy was just this quixotic idea bouncing around in my head. It was one of those, if I were king of the world, this is what I would do kind of ideas that all of us have every now and again. And today, as Jay said, it's mentioned in Time magazine. It was one of the top 10 ideas for the next president to pursue. 3 years ago, I was living happily in rural Mississippi, just about 3 or 4 hours from here. 2 hours from the nearest airport in a town of 800 people working with teenagers. And now, I fly around the country giving lectures and speaking at conferences and meeting with folks like Senator Clinton. And it's crazy. I mean, 3 years ago, I was sitting in front of a computer in my home, was surrounded by cotton fields and catfish ponds, typing up a proposal that I wasn't even sure anybody would read, let alone, a proposal that's turned into this movement where thousands of people have done research and written letters and signed petitions and made phone calls on our behalf. I mean, what started out as just a little idea has become a movement that has breached the walls of Congress. And sometimes I wonder, why is it that this idea has generated so much interest? And I think it's more than just that we need it. Yeah, the Academy will fulfill, critical needs in American society, but there's more to it than that. I think it's because it speaks to who we are as a people. I mean, if you think about it, we didn't need to put a man on the moon. I mean, come on. We could have gone along just fine without the space program. But we did it anyway, because we're a pioneering people. We seek out fresh frontiers, and we want to make our mark on history. That's who we are as Americans. We didn't need to build the national park system. I mean, our society would have churned on just fine without Yellowstone and Yosemite, even without Buffalo National River. We could have done fine without it. But we did it anyway, because we're a visionary people, because we seek out natural beauty, because we want to share our gifts with our posterity. That's just who we are as Americans. And we didn't need to create the Peace Corps. Sorry, we really didn't. The country would have managed just fine without it. But we did it anyway, because we're an idealistic people, because we seek out new challenges, because we want to share ourselves with the world. That's who we are as Americans. And that's why we need to build the Public Service Academy. We don't need it. We could muddle through. We could hope that our piecemeal efforts would be up to the job of inspiring a new generation of public servants. But Americans are not a people who are content with muddling through. We don't shrink from challenges just because they're expensive or daunting. For every grand American project, whether it's in the 1800s and building West Point, or in the 1960s and building the Peace Corps, or developing the national park system, or the space program, there have always been naysayers and cynics and folks who want to derail or belittle and mock the effort. In the end, however, we've always mustered the will to proceed despite the costs and the hardships, because we're determined to make our children's America better even than the one in which we grew up. Because we wanted to do our part to help America live up to its promise. Now, it's hard to imagine our country without West Point, or the Peace Corps, or the park system, or the space program. And a generation from now, people will look back and wonder not just how, but why we ever got along without the Public Service Academy. So I invite you to join us because we need citizens from every corner of the country to help us mobilize support for the Academy. I want you to join us because our movement has been sustained by the energy of young people and those who are young at heart. And I hope you'll join us because we have a small window of opportunity to build this institution that will have a lasting impact on American life. But more broadly, I want you to join us because we see the Academy as part of a larger national movement to reinvigorate our sense of public service, to rekindle our shared sense of what it means to be American at a time when our country desperately needs us to work together to find common solutions. You don't have to be an old-fashioned liberal to believe in the power of government. You don't have to be a Democrat to think that our people deserve more from our public institutions. You don't have to be part of the loony left to love public service. And at the same time, you don't have to be a right-wing fanatic to talk about duty, honor, and country. You don't have to be a Republican to wave a flag and belt out the Star-Spangled Banner. You don't have to be one of Rush Limbaugh's ditto heads to love America and be proud of what we have accomplished in our country. But you do have to care. You have to care about making our country a better place for all of our people. You have to care about helping our nation tackle the critical challenges of the 21st century. And you have to care enough to, in Abraham Lincoln's work, strive on to finish the work we are in, the work of making America live up to its founding ambitions. I hope you'll care. Thanks.
Hi, sir. Thank you. My name is David Green. I came here because I have 4 young children, and it intrigued me. I'm a military officer, but this is something that would be really great specifically for either my daughter or my sons. What time frame are you thinking of, and location, and more of the specifics?
Sure. Time frame, well, I wish it were up to me. We'd have already started by now. But best case scenario is that we are going to reintroduce our bill early, in the first 100 days of the next session. We already have 23 senators, 123 representatives. Depending on what happens with the elections, we may be able to generate even more support and just hit the ground running. Ideally, the bill would be passed by this time next year. We call for a 2-year startup window. So by year 3, fall of 2011, we would take our first freshmen and have them on campus. As for where the campus would be, that's not in the bill as written, partially by design, because once you say it's going to be in one place, everybody gets upset. We advocate for it to be in Washington, D.C. That's where George Washington wanted it, the symbolic power of having it in the nation's capital. And there are opportunities and resources in the D.C. area that are hard to replicate elsewhere. But we think it could happen, it could succeed in a lot of different areas. The places that have already started to kind of jockey for position include Philadelphia, where the mayor wants to put it downtown at the Navy Yard, Seattle, where the commander of Whidbey Bay Naval Air Station has already said that he'd be willing to allocate a couple hundred acres to the Public Service Academy. Both U.S. senators are on board, and Houston. So, it could wind up in West Virginia, because Robert Byrd may want to put it there. But again, it could succeed in any number of places, and we look forward to having that debate, because that means the larger issue is already settled.
Sanford, right here.
Chris, I think I may have met you before, but I'm a student here at the Clinton School, Class 3. I'm also an 03 Corps member from Teach for America, the Mississippi Delta.
Go TFA.
Yeah, thank you for coming down. I wanted to ask you a question about the presidential candidates. What specifically have they said about supporting the school?
It's a great question, and it's one of these issues where we got kind of caught politically, because Senator Clinton was actually the first person on Capitol Hill to reach out to us. She'd read an article about our effort in the Washington Post and instructed her staff to find us. And I mean, when she did, this was the middle of 2006. I mean, we hardly even had a website. I mean, our website was pathetic. If you Googled U.S. Public Service Academy, we were on page 5 or something. So they eventually found us and got on board. And one of the first people who read the article and volunteered to help us was a woman, a web page developer, who said, "I think you need some help." So she changed our website in short order. But Senator Clinton got involved. She didn't want to introduce the bill until we had a Republican co-sponsor, and so we got Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania as a Republican co-sponsor, and she's been wonderfully supportive. But that's great, but of course that creates political problems, because she was running for president, you may have heard. And so when she was running for president, the other presidential candidates were kind of, they didn't want to touch the Public Service Academy, because that was her bill, and they wanted to do their own, pursue their own ideas. Everybody's trying to differentiate themselves. To his credit, Joe Biden signed on as a co-sponsor, but Barack Obama did not. Nonetheless, his staff has indicated he supports the idea. He would sign the bill if it came to his desk. He's gung-ho about it. I've talked to him personally about it 2 times, and he said it's going to happen. As for John McCain, he's much harder to get a hold of for whatever reason, and we have not gotten a firm commitment from him. But to be honest, I mean, when I was writing this proposal up, he was one of the people that I thought would be most inclined to support this because of his Naval Academy background and because he talks about civilian service. Mike Huckabee, when he was running for president, endorsed the idea, but of course, we know what happened to him.
Todd?
Todd Moore. I'm a student here at the Clinton School in Class 4. I really appreciate and really love the concept behind public service academy. One of the things that I'm getting a little bogged down with, and can you talk a little more about the curriculum, what it would look like? Because you're talking about a really broad application, because government is a pretty broad application, and public service incorporates more than just government. There's nonprofit management and whatnot. So will you talk a little more about what the curriculum may look like?
Sure. First of all, one of the things that we will focus on is government work. I know at the Clinton School of Public Service, the definition is much broader, and I believe in that too. I mean, as Jay said, I ran a nonprofit myself for 7 years, but I think for the Public Service Academy, because it's a publicly funded institution, it will focus exclusively on public service as defined as working in government institutions, publicly funded institutions. That's still very broad, obviously. But of course, every undergraduate college in the country prepares students to go into any number of different fields. And so it would actually be more tailored than most schools are. The way we envision the curriculum is this. The first 2 years will be primarily made up of core courses, the way they are at the military academies. And the core courses will focus on two major elements. First is civic education, so all students would have a shared vocabulary of American history, government, economics, ethics and leadership, and so forth. And the other pillar would be international education. All students would be required to study abroad, master a foreign language. We think that those two things are essential for any public servant of the 21st century, no matter where they wind up. After their initial 2 years, they would then pursue their own majors. They would have a liberal arts major. It might be history or economics or biology. But they would also choose a public service concentration. We wouldn't have double majors. They wouldn't have time for that. But they would choose a public service concentration. And we've identified 6 fields. These are fields where we have critical needs already. And they include education, public health, law enforcement, emergency management, energy and environment, and foreign affairs. And so a student would get on one of those tracks, they would do an internship in that field, they would do coursework in that field, and that's the field in which they would be placed post-graduation. So you're right to say that it is very broad. We want to build a strong foundation of civic and international education, and then have the students choose a particular track that would then give them some specialized focus.
Got a question right here, Annie. Let's wait for the mic there.
Thank you. Welcome home.
Thank you.
My question is, in the vision that you have laid out and the curriculum that was just discussed, one of the areas that we're weak in now is trying to find quality candidates to serve in governance roles. Would this academy increase the reservoir of future candidates? Would they be in that reservoir to run for public office and could hit the ground running? Because now with term limit, it takes some time for some of the elected officials to get a clear understanding of what public service is in governance.
You're right. I mean, you've hit on an issue that's even bigger than the Public Service Academy, and that is getting top quality candidates to commit to running for office. The students at the Public Service Academy would not be placed in partisan political positions. They would not be allowed to run for office, for example, during their 5-year service commitment. Like in the military, you would have to be nonpartisan. This is to build up the nonpartisan government expertise. That's not ideological. That would serve no matter who's the president, no matter who's the governor. Beyond the 5-year commitment, of course, they'll be finished with their service. We would love for them, we would encourage them to stay on in the public sector, to stay on in public service. But many of them will go and pursue a variety of different options, one of which we hope would be elected officials. I mean, we certainly believe that spending 5 years in the public sector would give a future candidate a lot of direct experience to actually know what goes on the ground. So you wouldn't get folks who fly off the handle about government this and government that without actually knowing anything. So I think future, down the road, future Public Service Academy graduates could run for office, but that's not our focus.
Questions? Yes, sir, right there. Hey, Don.
Chris, thanks for your vision. You mentioned that teaching or education might well be part of either the curriculum or the makeup of the academy. I think one of the things that's missing so much in K-12 settings is this wonderful pedagogy called service learning. And it strikes me that there are wonderful ways to parlay that preparation of teachers, networking with others, the Corporation for National Service and others that give us some resources to sort of bear up, if you will, expanding service learning in K-12 settings. Could you expand on how you have any connections or visions about how you would?
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't mention it, but service learning, there would be requirements for service learning that they would have to do every year. So every year they would have to take a course that has a service learning component so that they're out in the community. Basically, service learning at the college level means college students participate in a service project, work in the community, and then come back and reflect on that in a classroom setting, read, discuss, learn more about the context of what they're doing. So they're not just going out and doing drive-by volunteering, here and there, but they actually understand the full context of it. So that's something we have incorporated into the curriculum as a requirement, a mandatory part of every student's curriculum. And part of the reason is we want our students to be actively engaged in the community, providing direct service in the community. Even though they may be working with a nonprofit organization in that context, or they may be working in a public school or a public agency, but it's important for young people to get the experience of working directly with people, so they have an understanding firsthand of the challenges that citizens face every day.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Sharon, and I'm a bureaucrat.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah. You mentioned local, state, and national service, but you didn't mention the possibility of following in your dear father's footsteps of doing foreign service. Would that be another option for graduates?
It would. That was actually the sixth of the areas that you can do. And basically, I say national service because that's considered national since you'd be working for the U.S. Department of State. But absolutely. Although State Department positions are rather competitive, there are a number of other positions, particularly foreign language experts, translators and such, especially in languages like Arabic and Pashtun and Mandarin, that's where we would focus. So, I mentioned that every student would have to study abroad and master a foreign language. Well, the vast majority, 2/3 of young people who study abroad in Western Europe. And that's great, I think that's wonderful. When I was growing up, I lived in Spain, with my family. I love Western Europe. But for a national university that's focused on national needs, we would be tailored more towards sending people to the Middle East, to India, to China, to Korea, to areas where we know we have national interests. So they would be learning those more difficult languages. That's why a lot of those first 2 years is going to be language training. So the short answer is yes.
And Chris, I'm sure you're going to incorporate in the legislation that, much like West Point and the Naval Academy, that people can pursue graduate school opportunities from the U.S. Public Service.
Absolutely. Actually, it's written into the bill that if they attend a public graduate school, they could have their tuition paid for in return for more years of service at the end, which is what the military academies do.
I knew I liked that bill. Any other questions for Chris? He's going to spend time visiting with our students and having our people. Let's thank him for coming today.